As Ethan Hayes steps into the CEO role at Hayward Industries, he's immediately met with resistance. The company is spiraling, and its old leadership, including the ousted Mark Delaney and skeptical CFO Melissa Grayson, aren't ready for change. But Ethan has a bold vision for innovation, and he's determined to save the company from collapse. Along the way, unlikely voices like Jamila Jam Reynolds, a junior assistant, find their strength, while the old guard clings to power. Will Ethan's leadership transform the company, or will those clinging to the past drag it down? What would you do in Ethan's place? Share your thoughts in the comments, and be sure to subscribe for more powerful stories of leadership, change, and redemption. Ethan Hayes adjusted the cufflinks on his perfectly tailored suit, breathing in deeply as he stared at his reflection in the mirror. This wasn't just another meeting. It was the meeting. His moment to finally step into the role of CEO, the position he had been working toward for years. Today, everything would change. He straightened his posture and ran a hand over his short, neatly cropped hair. His appearance was flawless, yet deep down he felt the gnawing tension of what was to come. The board of Hayward Industries had handpicked him to lead the company into the future, but none of the executives in today's meeting knew that yet. He was there to observe, and though he was more than ready for the challenge, he knew that his real test wouldn't be numbers or strategy. It would be overcoming the biases he had faced time and time again. The elevator chimed as it reached the 25th floor. Ethan's heart pounded in sync with the soft ping, and he walked out into the pristine hallway leading to the executive boardroom. Through the glass doors, he could see the group had already gathered inside. Mark Delaney, the current CEO, stood confidently at the head of the table, laughing with Melissa Grayson, the icy CFO who was known for her cutthroat decision-making. Bradley Turner, the marketing director, was already checking his phone, ignoring the meeting altogether. Ethan entered the room quietly, but the room instantly grew colder. The moment he crossed the threshold, the conversation stopped. Mark gave him a fleeting glance, barely acknowledging him. No handshake, no greeting, just a dismissive glance before turning back to Melissa. Ethan swallowed down the knot of frustration that rose in his throat. This wasn't his first experience being judged before he even spoke, but he knew today would be different. "Excuse me," Ethan said, his voice calm yet carrying the professionalism that had brought him this far. "I'm here for the shareholders' meeting." Melissa glanced up from the stack of papers in front of her, her eyes narrowing for a brief moment. "The coffee table is over there," she said, nodding toward the back of the room without even bothering to look up fully. Ethan's stomach twisted, but he kept his composure. They assumed he was staff. Of course they did. His gut told him to speak up, to correct them, but he bit his tongue. Now wasn't the time. Instead, he gave a slight nod, stepping aside to let them believe what they wanted for now. He quietly took a seat near the back of the room, observing the group as they prepared for the meeting. As the remaining executives filled the room, a tension lingered in the air. Each one greeted Mark or Melissa with an obligatory handshake, but not a single one looked in Ethan's direction. He was invisible, just another background figure in their world. But that would change soon. Mark Delaney finally cleared his throat and called the meeting to order, his voice carrying the authority that came with years of leading a multi-billion-dollar company. "All right, let's get started. We have a lot to cover. The last few quarters have been rough, and it's time we figure out what we need to do to turn this around." Ethan leaned forward slightly, his mind already buzzing with ideas. He knew exactly what needed to be done, but for now, he remained silent. He had to play his cards right. His moment would come. Mark kicked off the meeting with the confidence of a man who believed he had all the answers. "So, first things first. I've reviewed the reports from last quarter, and it's clear we need to cut back on spending." Melissa and I have been discussing the possibility of trimming the budget for R&D. Melissa nodded, her expression tight as always. We need to focus on short-term survival. The innovation team's projects are long shots, and frankly, they're not yielding the immediate results we need. Ethan felt the tension in the pit of his stomach tighten. He wanted to speak, to point out the glaring flaw in their approach, but he knew his time would come. For now, he would observe. Across the table, Bradley Turner shifted in his chair, barely paying attention to the conversation. He was more interested in his phone, scrolling through his emails, than in the fate of the company. When he finally looked up, he chimed in lazily. Honestly, I think we should consider outsourcing some of our operations. Labor overseas is cheaper and we can cut costs there. Outsourcing? Claire Edwards, the operations director, shot back, her voice sharp. You realize that would cripple our domestic workforce, right? Not to mention, we'll be sacrificing quality. Ethan glanced at Claire. She was the only one who seemed remotely engaged in the long-term future of the company. But even she wasn't seeing the bigger picture. Outsourcing wouldn't fix the deeper issue. They needed innovation, not cuts. The debate dragged on, with Melissa pushing for budget reductions, Bradley suggesting layoffs and outsourcing, and Claire valiantly trying to defend the workers under her department's oversight. Meanwhile, Mark remained at the head of the table, pretending to mediate but clearly leaning toward Melissa's approach. Ethan clenched his jaw, his frustration building with every minute that passed. It was the same old song and dance. A leadership team, too, caught up in their own agendas to see what the company truly needed. He made a few notes in his leather-bound portfolio, though he already knew the solutions that would save Hayward Industries. Still, he remained quiet. He needed to see just how dysfunctional this team really was before making his move. As the meeting wore on, it became clear just how deep the problems ran at Hayward Industries. The company wasn't just facing financial issues, it was rotting from the inside out. The executives were more concerned with protecting their own positions and egos than with finding real solutions. The moment finally came when Ethan decided he couldn't stay silent any longer. He watched as the conversation circled back to cutting the innovation budget, a decision that would have catastrophic long-term consequences for the company. His heart pounded as he sat up straighter in his chair, ready to speak. I disagree, Ethan said, his voice steady but firm. Innovation is what will drive this company forward. Cutting that budget is a mistake. The room fell silent, every head turned in his direction. For the first time, it seemed like they actually noticed him, but not in the way he'd hoped. Bradley scoffed, leaning back in his chair. With all due respect, who are you again? Ethan's face flushed with frustration. He was about to answer when Mark cut him off, waving his hand dismissively. Let's move on. We don't have time for input from... I have years of experience in innovation and management, Ethan interrupted, his voice louder now. You can't afford to ignore the very thing that will save this company. Mark frowned, clearly irritated by the interruption. We're not here for opinions from the support staff. Support staff. The word stung, but Ethan swallowed down the bitterness rising in his throat. He could feel the weight of the moment hanging in the air, every eye on him as he considered his next move. It wasn't about proving them wrong anymore. It was about forcing them to see who he really was. Ethan stood up, his posture straight and commanding, though his heart raced with anticipation. I think it's time I properly introduce myself. The room grew tense, the silence thick as Mark, Melissa, and the others exchanged confused glances. Melissa raised an eyebrow, clearly not prepared for what was about to happen. Mark was the first to break the silence. Look, I don't know who you think you are. I'm Ethan Hayes, he said, his voice sharp and cutting through the tension like a knife. And I've been appointed by the board as your new CEO. The words hung in the air like a thunderclap. The shock was immediate. Mark's face went pale, Melissa dropped her pen, and Bradley blinked in disbelief. Claire's eyes widened in surprise as the realization of what had just happened sank in. Mark stood up, his face flushed with anger and embarrassment. "That can't be right. No one informed me of this." Ethan calmly reached into his briefcase and pulled out the official document from the board, handing it to Mark. "It's all here. I officially take over next Monday." The room remained silent as the paper passed between the executives. Melissa, who had previously dismissed him, now looked at Ethan with a mixture of disbelief and regret. Claire seemed shocked, but intrigued. But it was Mark's reaction that stood out the most. He was livid, clearly not used to being challenged, let alone replaced. His pride was wounded, and it showed. Ethan looked around the room, meeting the eyes of each executive. "I chose not to introduce myself earlier because I wanted to see how you all operated, how you treated someone you thought was beneath you." The room remained quiet, the weight of his words pressing down on the group. Ethan could see the regret starting to form in some of their faces, but the real test was only just beginning. The silence after Ethan's announcement felt like it stretched on forever. The shock that had swept through the room still lingered as the executives processed the gravity of what had just happened. Mark Delaney, the now displaced CEO, stood frozen, his mouth hanging open as he glanced at the official document Ethan had handed him. This can't be right," Mark stammered, his eyes scanning the document for any loophole or mistake that might validate his disbelief. "No one informed me of this decision. How could the board appoint a new CEO without consulting me?" Ethan met Mark's incredulous stare with calm composure. "The board's decision was made based on the direction this company needs to take. They saw the need for change, a need for leadership that prioritizes not just short-term survival, but long-term innovation." Melissa Grayson, the stern CFO, snatched the document from Mark's hands, her eyes narrowing as she skimmed the official letter from the board. She was known for her ability to remain unflustered, but she even looked rattled. This is real," she murmured. Across the table, Bradley Turner, the head of marketing, leaned back in his chair, running a hand through his thinning hair. He let out a low whistle, his gaze flicking between Ethan and Mark. "Well, this just got interesting," he said with a smirk, clearly enjoying the drama that had just unfolded. Claire Edwards, the operations director, glanced at Ethan with wide eyes. She had been quiet for most of the meetings, but now she spoke up. "If you're the new CEO, why didn't you just say so from the start?" Ethan inhaled deeply, his expression softening as he prepared to explain himself. "Because I needed to understand how this leadership team functions, or in this case, doesn't function." His gaze traveled across the room, settling on each executive in turn. "I needed to see firsthand how decisions are made, how you treat people you think are beneath you, and what kind of culture this company is truly fostering." Mark's face flushed an even deeper shade of red. "So this was some kind of test," he spat, his voice trembling with barely concealed rage. "Not a test," Ethan corrected, "but an observation. And what I saw was a leadership team more focused on cutting costs and maintaining the status quo than on finding real solutions. This company is facing a crisis, and instead of fostering innovation and growth, you're cutting back on the very things that could save it." Melissa folded her arms across her chest, her gaze cold and calculating. "So, what? You think you can just waltz in here and fix everything?" Ethan held her gaze. "I don't think I can do it alone, but I do know that this company needs to change drastically." Mark Delaney, still clutching the board's letter, slammed his hand down on the table. "You think you know what this company needs? You've been here for what, a couple of hours? I've been running this place for years." "And in those years," Ethan said calmly, "the company has been steadily declining. You've lost touch with your workforce, with your customers, and with the future. That's why the board chose me to lead." The tension in the room was rising, like an overfilled balloon ready to burst. Ethan remained composed, but he could sense the storm brewing. Mark wasn't about to go down without a fight, and Ethan knew that his true challenge was just beginning. "I won't stand for this," Mark growled, shoving the letter back across the table. "I built this company, and I'll be damned if some outsider is going to come in and take it from me." "You didn't build it alone, Mark," Claire interjected softly, trying to diffuse the situation. "We've all been part of this company's success and its struggles." Mark shot her a glare that could have frozen water. "Stay out of this, Claire." Ethan stood on his ground, his calm demeanor unwavering. "I understand that change is difficult, but the board has made its decision. We're at a crossroads, and I'm here to guide this company into a new era." Melissa raised an eyebrow, her arms still folded across her chest. "And what exactly is this new era supposed to look like?" Ethan leaned forward slightly, his voice steady but filled with conviction. "It's an era where we prioritize innovation over stagnation, where we focus on long-term growth rather than short-term cuts. And most importantly, it's an era where we build a culture that values diversity, inclusion, and respect." Bradley snorted, his smirk widening. "Oh great, here we go with the buzzwords. Diversity and inclusion? Give me a break." Ethan's eyes darkened, but he kept his voice measured. "This isn't about buzzwords, Bradley. It's about building a company where every voice is heard, where people are valued for their contributions, not judged by their appearance or background." Bradley rolled his eyes. "Right. Because a diversity program is going to save the company." "It's not just about a program," Ethan replied, his tone firm. "It's about changing the way we think, the way we lead, the way we make decisions." Mark, still seething, took a step closer to Ethan. "You don't know anything about this company. You don't know what it takes to lead it." Ethan met Mark's glare head on. "I know more than you think, and I'm ready to prove it." The room felt thick with tension as the standoff between Ethan and Mark dragged on. Mark wasn't just fighting for his position, he was fighting for his pride, his ego, and his identity as the company's leader. But Ethan had no intention of backing down. He had been through too much, faced too many challenges to be intimidated now. He had been hired for a reason, and he wasn't about to let this opportunity slip away. "If you want to talk about leadership," Ethan said, his voice calm but commanding, "then let's talk about what real leadership looks like." Mark scoffed, crossing his arms over his chest. "Oh, I'd love to hear this." "Real leadership," Ethan continued, "isn't about holding on to power at all costs. It's about making the tough decisions even when they're unpopular. It's about listening to the people around you, not just the ones who agree with you, but the ones who challenge you. It's about having the vision to see beyond the immediate crisis and to build something better for the future." Mark's jaw clenched, but he said nothing. Ethan turned to address the rest of the room. "This company is on the edge of collapse, and if we don't change course now, it's going to fall apart. The solutions you've been discussing, cutting costs, laying off workers, outsourcing jobs, they're all short-term fixes that won't solve the underlying problems." "And what do you suggest?" Melissa asked, her voice sharp. "Pour more money into projects that aren't delivering results?" Ethan nodded. "Yes, I do, because innovation takes time. You don't see the returns immediately, but when they come, they're the difference between survival and failure." Claire, who had been listening intently, spoke up. "He's right. We've been too focused on the bottom line, on making numbers look good for the next quarter. But we're not investing in the future." Bradley sighed, rubbing his temples. "And how exactly do you propose we fix that?" We don't have unlimited resources, you know. We focus on what makes this company great, Ethan replied. We focus on our people. We invest in innovation and new ideas. We stop making decisions based on fear and start making them based on vision. Mark let out a harsh laugh. Vision? This company doesn't need vision. It needs cold, hard cash. And how do you think you're going to get that cash? Ethan asked, his voice rising slightly. By cutting corners, by laying off workers. That's a race to the bottom, and it's a race we'll lose. Melissa frowned, considering his words. So you're saying we just throw more money at R&D and hope it works? I'm saying we need to be smart about our investments, Ethan replied. But more importantly, we need to change the way we lead, the way we treat people. That starts at the top, with this leadership team. Mark's eyes narrowed. What exactly are you getting at? Ethan met his gaze evenly. I'm talking about a culture shift, a change in how we view leadership, how we make decisions, how we treat the people who work for us. The air in the room had shifted. The tension was still palpable. But there was something else now, something Ethan had been waiting for. Curiosity, uncertainty, the possibility that, just maybe, he was right. Melissa leaned back in her chair, her sharp gaze still fixed on Ethan. You talk a big game, Hayes, but you haven't shown us anything yet. What exactly is your plan? Ethan took a deep breath, steeling himself for the next phase of his argument. He had laid the groundwork, but now he needed to show them that his vision wasn't just theoretical, it was practical, actionable, and necessary. We start by investing in our people, Ethan said. That means launching a company-wide re-education initiative, a program focused on leadership development, diversity, and inclusion. Bradley groaned. Here we go with the diversity thing again. Ethan ignored him, focusing instead on Melissa and Claire. It's not just about diversity for diversity's sake. It's about creating an environment where people feel valued, where they're encouraged to speak up and contribute. Right now, we have a culture of fear. People are afraid to take risks, to share new ideas because they think they'll be punished for it. Claire nodded slowly, her expression thoughtful. I've seen that. People are disengaged because they don't feel like their voices matter. Exactly, Ethan said. And when people feel like they don't matter, they stop caring. They stop giving their best. We need to change that, starting with this leadership team. Mark let out a derisive snort. So what? You're going to give us all a seminar on how to be nice to employees? It's not about being nice, Ethan replied, his voice firm. It's about being effective, about creating a culture where innovation can thrive, where people feel safe enough to take risks and push boundaries. Melissa leaned forward, her eyes sharp with interest. And how do you propose we make that happen? Ethan met her gaze, feeling the weight of the moment pressing down on him. This was it, the turning point. He could feel the tide shifting, but he needed to make them see the urgency of the situation. We start with a leadership overhaul. That means training, yes, but it also means holding ourselves accountable. We need to recognize our own biases, our own limitations, and actively work to change them. Claire raised an eyebrow. You're talking about changing the entire culture of the company. Ethan nodded. Exactly. It's a massive undertaking, but it's the only way we're going to survive. As the days passed after Ethan's explosive introduction as the new CEO, Hayward Industries felt like a battlefield. Ethan had taken immediate steps to implement his vision, starting with leadership meetings and plans for diversity and inclusion workshops. But the old guard was not going down without a fight. Mark Delaney, the former CEO, hadn't shown his face in the office since the board's decision was announced. Instead, he was rallying the more conservative shareholders behind the scenes, whispering words of discontent, urging them to question Ethan's qualifications. He called in favors, used his influence, and push the narrative that Ethan's radical ideas, particularly the focus on diversity and inclusion, would drive the company further into financial turmoil. In the boardroom, the atmosphere was tense. Ethan stood at the head of the long table, addressing the executive team in one of his first formal meetings as CEO. He outlined the re-education program, detailing how leadership training and company-wide initiatives would help shift the culture to one of openness, innovation, and inclusion. "I don't see how this is relevant to our core business," Bradley interrupted with a dismissive wave. "We're here to make money, Ethan, not to run a social experiment." Melissa Grayson, who had been skeptical of Ethan from the start, remained tight-lipped, her fingers drumming on the table. Claire Edwards, on the other hand, sat forward, clearly engaged with Ethan's ideas but hesitant to speak up. Ethan didn't flinch at Bradley's comment. "This isn't a social experiment, Bradley. This is about creating an environment where people can contribute their best ideas, where employees feel valued and motivated. When people feel engaged, they're more productive, and that directly affects the bottom line." Bradley scoffed. "I've been in this business long enough to know that what really motivates people is a paycheck, not a diversity seminar." Ethan locked eyes with him, refusing to let the cynicism win. "Paychecks are important, but they're not enough. The world is changing, and if we don't change with it, Hayward Industries will be left behind." The room was silent for a moment, the tension thick. Melissa finally broke it, speaking in her usual cool tone. "I see the value in what you're proposing, but the shareholders need more than just talk about culture shifts. They want numbers, Ethan. What's your plan for financial recovery?" Ethan leaned forward slightly, sensing a shift in the conversation. "We're not abandoning financial recovery, Melissa. In fact, that's a key part of the plan. But cutting budgets and layoffs won't lead to sustainable growth. We need to double down on innovation, develop new products, expand into new markets, and invest in the kind of ideas that set us apart from our competitors." Claire nodded, speaking up for the first time. "I agree. We can't keep playing defense forever. We need to start thinking long-term." Bradley rolled his eyes. "You all are dreaming if you think this kind of idealism is going to fly with the shareholders." Ethan turned his gaze toward Bradley, keeping his tone measured but firm. "The shareholders want to see results, and I intend to give them that. But those results are going to come from innovation and forward thinking, not from gutting the company." Despite Ethan's determination, the resistance from the old guard continued to grow. Mark Delaney had been pulling strings behind the scenes, calling up shareholders, sowing doubt about Ethan's leadership. The more conservative factions were beginning to align with Mark, claiming that Ethan's radical approach, particularly his focus on inclusivity, was leading the company astray. At the next shareholder meeting, the tension reached a boiling point. Ethan stood at the podium in the large conference hall, facing a room filled with shareholders, some of them loyal to Mark and skeptical of Ethan's vision. Mark, with his usual air of superiority, sat near the front, arms crossed, glaring at Ethan as if daring him to falter. Ethan, however, had come prepared. "I know there are concerns about the direction we're taking," Ethan began, his voice steady and confident. "But I want to make something very clear. The changes we're implementing are not a distraction from the company's financial goals. In fact, they're essential to our survival." A murmur spread through the room as Ethan continued, detailing his plan to revitalize the company's product line, expand into international markets, and invest in research and development. He presented clear data, showing how companies that prioritized diversity and innovation had outperformed their competitors. Mark stood abruptly, cutting into the conversation. "With all due respect, Ethan, this is all theory. You're talking about big ideas, but where's the proof? Our stock has been dropping, and shareholders want to know what you're going to do about that now." The room buzzed with tension. Ethan knew this was a critical moment. Mark was trying to undermine him, to paint him as someone with lofty ideals but no real solutions. Ethan took a deep breath, meeting Mark's challenge head-on. The stock has been dropping because we've been cutting costs at the expense of growth. We've been reactive instead of proactive. My plan is to turn that around by investing in the future of this company, by expanding our reach, innovating in ways our competitors haven't, and creating a corporate culture that attracts top talent. Mark's smirk widened. You think a diversity program is going to save this company? Ethan's jaw tightened. It's not just a diversity program. It's about creating a workplace where the best ideas can thrive, where innovation is encouraged, and where we're not just following the trends, we're setting them. The shareholders shifted uncomfortably, their uncertainty evident. Mark pressed on, trying to tip the scales. This company needs immediate action. What's your plan for turning around the stock price in the next quarter? Ethan's frustration flared, but he kept his composure. Mark, the kind of short-term thinking that got us here won't get us out. My focus is on sustainable growth, not temporary fixes. The room was silent for a long moment. Mark finally sat down, a satisfied smirk on his face, as if he had won the exchange. But Ethan wasn't finished. I understand that change is difficult, Ethan said, addressing the room. But if we don't make these changes now, we'll be left behind. We're not just fighting for survival, we're fighting for the future of this company. And that future is built on innovation, inclusion, and a long-term vision for success. There was a murmur of agreement from some shareholders, but Ethan knew he hadn't convinced everyone. The battle was far from over. Just as Ethan began to make headway with his new initiatives, disaster struck. A key international partnership that had been in the works for months suddenly fell apart. The deal was with a major tech company in Asia, and its failure sent shockwaves through Hayward Industries. The company's stock plummeted further, and the whispers of doubt grew louder. Ethan found himself inundated with calls from anxious shareholders and panicked executives. Even those who had started to support him were beginning to waver. Ethan, this deal was supposed to be our big move into the global market, Melissa said during an emergency meeting. Her usual cool demeanor was tinged with frustration. Without it, we're facing an even bigger uphill battle. Bradley was more blunt. This is it. We're sinking fast and we need to do something drastic. Ethan could feel the weight of the crisis pressing down on him. The failure of the deal wasn't his fault. There were external factors at play. But that didn't matter. As the CEO, the responsibility fell on his shoulders. The media began speculating about Ethan's future as CEO, with articles questioning whether his focus on diversity and inclusion had distracted him from the company's more pressing financial issues. Mark, ever the opportunist, began making moves to push for a vote of no confidence from the shareholders. At night, Ethan found himself alone in his office, staring out at the city skyline. His vision for Hayward Industries seemed to be slipping away piece by piece. For the first time since taking on the role, he questioned whether he had made the right choice in focusing so heavily on corporate culture when the company's finances were in such disarray. He hadn't wanted to resort to layoffs and budget cuts, but the pressure was mounting. Maybe, just maybe, he had overestimated what he could achieve. Maybe Mark had been right all along. Maybe the company just needed someone who could keep it afloat for a little while longer. But deep down, Ethan knew that wasn't the answer. He couldn't abandon his vision just because things were getting tough. He had been chosen to lead this company for a reason, and it wasn't to preserve the status quo. One evening, long after most of the staff had gone home, Ethan sat in his office, his hands gripping the arms of his chair. The pressure of the crisis, the doubts swirling around him, and the relentless criticism were all weighing on him. He had been strong up until now, but even the strongest people had their limits. Claire knocked on his door before stepping inside. "Ethan, you still here?" Ethan glanced up, his face drawn and weary. He hadn't spoken to anyone about his doubts, but Claire had a way of reading people. She saw through the calm exterior he had been trying so hard to maintain. "Rough day?" she asked gently, sitting across from him. Ethan let out a long breath, finally letting down his guard. "You could say that. The partnership falling through, the stock dropping. It feels like everything's slipping through my fingers." Claire nodded, her expression understanding. "It's not your fault, you know. The deal was already shaky." Ethan shook his head. "But I'm the CEO. It's my job to keep the company on track, and right now, I feel like I'm failing." "You're not failing," Claire said softly. "You're leading. There's a difference. Leadership isn't about avoiding failure. It's about navigating through it. You've been pushing for change, and that's never easy. But it's the right thing to do." Ethan looked at her, feeling a surge of gratitude. "It just feels like I'm the only one who believes in it sometimes." "You're not," Claire assured him. "Some of us see it. We see what you're trying to do, and we believe in it. You're building something that's going to last, something that will outlive this crisis. But you've got to push through." Ethan nodded, feeling a spark of hope reignite in his chest. Claire's words reminded him of why he had taken on this role in the first place. He wasn't just here to keep the company afloat. He was here to transform it. Ethan woke up the next morning feeling something different. Claire's words had sparked a fire inside him that he hadn't felt in weeks. He was done playing it safe. He knew the risks, and he knew the road ahead was full of obstacles. But he had a vision for Hayward Industries, and it was time to fight for it. At 8 a.m., he walked into the office with a renewed sense of purpose. The morning sun filtered through the glass walls of the executive floor, casting long shadows that seemed to mirror the heavy stakes of the day. Ethan's jaw tightened as he approached the boardroom where an emergency strategy meeting was about to take place. Inside the boardroom, the tension was thick. Melissa Grayson, the CFO, sat at the head of the table, cool and composed, but her eyes betrayed her unease. Bradley Turner leaned back in his chair, arms folded, clearly irritated with the continued discussions about Ethan's leadership. Claire Edwards sat toward the middle of the table, her brow furrowed in quiet contemplation, while the other executives exchanged uncertain glances. Before anyone could speak, the door swung open, and Mark Delaney strode in, uninvited, but acting as though he still had every right to be there. He gave Ethan a smug look, clearly expecting this to be the day Ethan would be thrown out of his position. "Well, here we are again," Mark said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Another crisis, another meeting, and no closer to a solution." Ethan remained unfazed. "Actually, Mark, we are closer to a solution. I've spent the last few days working on a new strategy, one that's going to get this company back on its feet and push us into the future." Mark scoffed. "Oh, this should be good." Ignoring the jibe, Ethan took his place at the head of the table and distributed the packets he had prepared. "What I'm proposing isn't just a Band-Aid solution. We've been playing defense for too long, cutting budgets, delaying projects, all in the hope that something will miraculously turn around. That's not going to happen. We need to stop reacting to problems and start being proactive." The executives opened the packet, scanning through the detailed outline. Claire was the first to look up, her expression one of surprise. "You're suggesting we push into international markets aggressively, despite the failure of the recent deal?" "Yes," Ethan said confidently. "But not the way we were approaching it before. We were trying to partner with established players in saturated markets. I want to look at emerging markets, places where we can be first movers, where we can create something new rather than compete for scraps." Bradley frowned, flipping through the pages. "Emerging markets? That's risky. There's no guarantee of success." "No," Ethan agreed. There isn't. But there's a much higher ceiling for growth. And if we can be the first to establish a presence, we'll have the advantage. Melissa, who had remained quiet so far, finally spoke. This plan requires significant investment in R&D. How do you propose we fund this without further destabilizing our current financial situation? Ethan had anticipated this question. We'll need to make some sacrifices, yes, but instead of cutting jobs or slashing budgets across the board, we focus on trimming the areas that aren't contributing to long-term growth. We streamline operations, cut unnecessary redundancies, and reinvest in our core strengths: innovation, product development, and expanding into new markets. Mark shook his head, a smirk on his face. You think you can gamble this company's future on some fantasy of global expansion? Ethan didn't flinch. It's not a fantasy, Mark. It's a calculated risk. The alternative is to keep doing what we've been doing, playing it safe, cutting corners, and eventually we'll lose everything. For a moment, the room was silent as the executives processed Ethan's words. It was Claire who finally broke the tension. I think it's brilliant. Bradley shot her with a look of disbelief. Brilliant or reckless? Both, Claire admitted, but sometimes that's exactly what we need. Ethan felt a surge of gratitude toward Claire. She had been one of the few to believe in his vision from the start, and now her support was giving him the momentum he needed. Melissa looked skeptical but intrigued. And you think this will work? I do, Ethan said, meeting her gaze squarely. But only if we commit to it fully. Half measures won't save us. Ethan's bold new strategy spread quickly throughout the company, creating a whirlwind of reactions. Some employees were invigorated by the idea of pushing into new markets, of embracing change and stepping into a new future. Others, especially in the more conservative sectors, were wary. The failure of the international partnership was still fresh in everyone's minds, and skepticism ran deep. The turning point came during a critical board meeting. Several key shareholders had been summoned to review Ethan's new strategy. Among them was William Carter, a longtime shareholder and close ally of Mark Delaney. Carter had been vocal in his criticisms of Ethan's leadership, particularly his focus on diversity and inclusion, which he saw as a distraction from the company's core mission. The boardroom was filled with a mix of anticipation and tension as Ethan presented his plan to the shareholders. He outlined the potential for growth in emerging markets, the innovation projects that were already in development, and the ways in which the company could streamline operations without gutting its workforce. When he finished, there was a long, pregnant pause. William Carter leaned forward, his expression a mix of skepticism and disdain. I appreciate the effort, Ethan, but let's be real here. We've just lost a major international partnership. The stock is tanking, and now you're suggesting we pour more resources into risky ventures. It sounds like you're gambling with the future of this company. Ethan remained composed. It's not gambling, Mr. Carter. It's strategy. The companies that survive crises like these are the ones that innovate, that look beyond immediate challenges and focus on long-term growth. Yes, it's risky, but the alternative is playing it so safe that we stagnate. Carter shook his head. And what about the shareholders? What about the people who've invested their money into this company and are seeing its value drop every day? That's exactly why we need to make bold moves now, Ethan replied. Short-term fixes won't restore value to this company. We need to show that we're thinking ahead, that we're not just reacting to problems, but actively creating opportunities. Mark, who had remained silent for most of the meeting, finally spoke up, his voice dripping with condescension. This all sounds very inspiring, Ethan, but you're forgetting something important. You can't run a company on vision alone. You need hard numbers, real results, and right now you have none. Ethan's heart pounded, but he didn't let Mark's words shake him. "That's where you're wrong, Mark. I've spent the last few weeks working with our R&D and operations teams, and we're already seeing results from the changes we've implemented. We've streamlined production, cut down on inefficiencies, and we're ready to roll out new product lines that will appeal to a broader international market." Melissa, who had been quietly reviewing the financial projections, spoke up. "The projections show that if we move forward with Ethan's plan, we could see a significant rebound within the next 2 quarters. It's a risk, yes, but it's one that could pay off in a big way." Carter looked unconvinced. "And if it doesn't pay off, what then?" Ethan didn't hesitate. "If it doesn't, I'll take full responsibility. But I believe in this company, and I believe in this plan. We've been playing defense for too long, and it's time we started playing to win." The room fell silent again, the tension thick in the air. Finally, William Carter leaned back in his chair, his expression hard. "You've got guts, Hayes, I'll give you that, but guts don't save companies. Results do." Ethan's jaw tightened. "And that's exactly what I intend to deliver." The vote came down to the wire, but in the end, Ethan's strategy was approved. The board was willing to take the risk, and the shareholders, though still wary, gave their tentative support. It was a narrow victory, but a victory nonetheless. Over the next several months, Ethan threw himself into executing his plan with everything he had. The diversity and inclusion programs he had introduced began to take root, with employees across the company reporting increased job satisfaction and engagement. New ideas flowed from every department as people who had once been sidelined were given the opportunity to contribute. The push into emerging markets wasn't without its challenges, but Ethan's focus on long-term growth began to pay off. The company launched new product lines tailored to the needs of these new markets, and for the first time in years, Hayward Industries was no longer just surviving. It was thriving. 6 months after the launch of his new strategy, Ethan stood in front of the entire company during a celebratory meeting. The stock had begun to recover, employees were more engaged than ever, and Hayward Industries had made inroads into markets that were once considered untouchable. Ethan scanned the faces of the employees and executives in the crowd. Melissa was there, her usual cool demeanor softened with a rare smile. Bradley, who had once been one of his biggest critics, now nodded in approval. And Claire, who had supported him from the start, gave him a knowing look, as if to say, "I told you so." Even Mark Delaney, who had fought tooth and nail against Ethan's leadership, had been forced to acknowledge the company's success. He sat near the back of the room, quiet, but no longer sneering. Ethan stepped up to the podium, his heart full of pride and gratitude. 6 months ago, we made a choice to stop playing it safe and start building for the future. It wasn't easy, and it wasn't without risk, but we did it. We're not just surviving anymore. We're growing, we're innovating, and we're doing it together. The room erupted in applause, and for the first time, Ethan allowed himself to smile fully. This was just the beginning of a new era for Hayward Industries, one that was built on collaboration, inclusion, and the belief that real innovation came from embracing every voice, not just the loudest. The first signs of the company's revival came faster than anyone had expected. 6 months into Ethan's leadership, the atmosphere at Hayward Industries had completely shifted. Where there had once been fear, complacency, and stagnation, there was now energy, innovation, and hope. The company's stock, which had been plummeting for over a year, began to stabilize. New investors took notice of Hayward's bold moves into emerging markets, and even the skeptical voices in the business media were beginning to change their tune. Ethan's strategy of focusing on long-term growth rather than short-term fixes was finally showing results, and it was clear that Hayward Industries was on the path to recovery. Ethan walked through the hallways of the company's headquarters one morning, feeling a sense of pride and satisfaction that he hadn't allowed himself in a long time. The office buzzed with activity, people moving with purpose, discussing ideas, and collaborating in ways that had been rare under the old leadership. He passed by the newly renovated Innovation Hub, a space that had been transformed from a neglected department into the heart of the company's creative energy. Inside, teams worked on prototypes for new products, brainstorming ideas for further expansion into global markets. The diversity of the teams, both in background and perspective, was palpable, and it was clear that the culture Ethan had fought so hard to instill was taking root. As Ethan walked past the glass walls of the hub, Rita, one of the junior engineers, waved him over excitedly. "Mr. Hayes, you've got to see this." He smiled and stepped inside, curious. Rita, along with a group of younger employees, had been working on a new product for the Asian market, a sleek, affordable gadget designed specifically for consumers in the region. "We think we've cracked it," Rita said, her eyes alight with enthusiasm. "This version solves the problem we had with the original prototype, and it's much more cost-effective." Ethan examined the prototype, impressed by the ingenuity on display. "This is incredible, Rita. Great work. When can we get this into production?" "We're already ahead of schedule," she said, beaming. "We could have a finished product in the next quarter." Ethan nodded, pride swelling in his chest. This was exactly the kind of forward-thinking innovation he had envisioned for the company. And it wasn't just about the products, it was about the people. Employees like Rita, who had once been overlooked, were now given the space to thrive, and it was making all the difference. The next major milestone came in the form of a quarterly board meeting, where Ethan would present the company's latest performance numbers and outline the next steps for growth. The atmosphere in the boardroom was very different from the tense, combative meetings of months prior. Melissa Grayson, the CFO, was reviewing the latest financial reports, and even she couldn't hide her surprise at the positive trends. "We've seen a 15% increase in revenue over the last quarter," she said, her usual cool demeanor replaced with cautious optimism. "And our international expansion into the Southeast Asian market is starting to yield results. The projections for the next fiscal year are impressive." Ethan nodded, his gaze sweeping over the faces of the board members, many of whom had once been his fiercest critics. Now, they looked at him with respect, some even with admiration. Even William Carter, who had been so vocal in his opposition to Ethan's leadership, seemed more subdued, glancing at the numbers in front of him with reluctant approval. "The changes we've made to our innovation pipeline and our push into emerging markets are starting to pay off," Ethan said, addressing the room. "But this is just the beginning. We're not going to settle for small gains. Our goal is long-term, sustainable growth. That means continuing to invest in new ideas, new talent, and new markets." Mark Delaney, the former CEO, sat near the back of the room, quiet but attentive. He hadn't spoken out against Ethan in months, and though his pride had clearly taken a hit, he no longer seemed intent on undermining him. Instead, he watched with a mix of quiet reflection and grudging respect. "Mr. Hayes," Carter spoke up, clearing his throat, "I have to admit, I was skeptical about your approach, but it's clear that the results speak for themselves. I was wrong to doubt your vision." Ethan acknowledged him with a nod, appreciating the humility in Carter's words. "I understand the concerns you had, Mr. Carter. Change is difficult, especially when it's drastic, but I believe we're building something that will last." Carter leaned back in his chair, nodding thoughtfully. "It seems you're right." Melissa tapped her pen on the table, her voice cutting in with its usual sharpness. "So, what's next?" "How do we keep this momentum going?" Ethan smiled. "By staying true to what got us here. We continue to invest in our people, in innovation, and in expanding our global reach. But most importantly, we keep pushing ourselves to think beyond the immediate. We're not here to survive anymore. We're here to lead. Despite the company's success, Ethan's journey had been as much about personal growth as it had been about professional triumph. Leading Hayward Industries through its transformation had forced him to confront his own fears, his doubts, and the obstacles that came with being underestimated at every turn. Late one evening, after a long day of meetings and planning sessions, Ethan found himself in his office staring out at the city skyline. The weight of the journey was still heavy on his shoulders, but there was also a sense of peace, a sense that he had found his place, both as a leader and as someone who had finally been seen for who he truly was. As he sat down at his desk, there was a knock on the door. Helena Mitchell, the chairwoman of the board, stepped inside. She was a sharp, elegant woman in her 50s, with a calm authority that commanded respect. "Mind if I come in?" Helena asked, smiling warmly. "Not at all," Ethan said, gesturing to the chair across from him. Helena sat down, crossing her legs and looking at him with a mixture of pride and amusement. "You know, when we chose you to take over this company, there were a lot of doubters. Some people thought we were crazy about bringing in someone with such unconventional ideas." Ethan smiled. "I remember." Helena chuckled softly. "But I knew you were exactly what this company needed. Someone who wasn't afraid to challenge the status quo. And you've proven us right." Ethan nodded, feeling the weight of her words. "Thank you, Helena. I couldn't have done it without the support of people like you." Helena leaned forward slightly, her expression turned more serious. "But I have to ask, after everything you've been through, after all the resistance you faced, what kept you going?" Ethan thought for a moment before answering. "I think it was the belief that real change, meaningful change, takes time, and that it's not about proving everyone wrong. It's about doing what's right for the people who depend on you, the employees, the customers, the shareholders, all of them." Helena nodded slowly, clearly impressed. "Well, you've certainly done that, and more." As she stood to leave, she paused at the door, looking back at him with a knowing smile. "You've made your mark, Ethan. This company is stronger, better, and more forward-thinking because of you. Don't forget that." Months passed, and Hayward Industries continued to thrive under Ethan's leadership. The company's expansion into international markets grew steadily, with new product lines tailored to emerging economies in Southeast Asia, Africa, and South America. The diversity and inclusion initiatives Ethan had championed were not just token gestures, they had become ingrained in the company's DNA. At an annual company-wide meeting, Ethan stood before hundreds of employees, both in person and via video conference, to address the company's continued progress. The atmosphere was electric, filled with excitement and pride. Employees who had once been disengaged and overlooked were now key contributors, driving innovation and shaping the future of the company. "I want to take a moment to recognize all of you," Ethan said, his voice carrying through the hall. "The success we've seen over the past year isn't because of me. It's because of you. Because of your ideas, your hard work, and your commitment to building something bigger than any of us." The crowd erupted in applause, and Ethan felt a swell of emotion. He had always known that real leadership wasn't about being at the top. It was about empowering others to reach their full potential. After the meeting, Jamila Jam Reynolds, the young administrative assistant who had once been too afraid to speak up in meetings, approached Ethan. Her eyes were bright with excitement, and there was a new confidence in her posture. "Mr. Hayes," she said, "I just wanted to thank you. A year ago, I didn't think someone like me could ever make a difference here. But now I feel like I matter." Ethan smiled, feeling a lump in his throat. You always mattered, Jam. You just needed the space to show it. As the months turned into years, Hayward Industries continued to grow, innovate, and lead in ways that no one had thought possible when Ethan first took over. The company's transformation became a case study in business schools across the country, a testament to the power of bold leadership and the importance of fostering an inclusive, innovative corporate culture. But for Ethan, the greatest reward wasn't the accolades or the financial success. It was the knowledge that he had helped create a company where people were valued not just for their positions or titles, but for who they were and what they could contribute. One day, as he stood on the rooftop of the company's headquarters, looking out over the bustling city below, Ethan reflected on the journey that had brought him here. It hadn't been easy. There had been moments when he had doubted himself, when the obstacles seemed insurmountable. But through it all, he had stayed true to his vision, and it had paid off. He knew that the work was far from over. There were still challenges to face, still hurdles to overcome. But for the first time in a long time, he felt a deep sense of peace. He had found his place, and he had helped others find theirs as well, and that, he realized, was the true measure of success. Mark Delaney stood in his now vacated office, the once bustling space eerily quiet. His belongings were packed in boxes, his nameplate removed from the desk. It was surreal. He had spent nearly a decade at the helm of Hayward Industries, convinced that his leadership was indispensable. But now, he was yesterday's news, a relic of a bygone era. The weight of defeat settled on his shoulders as he left the office for the last time. The hallway seemed longer than usual, every step echoing painfully in the silence. Employees who once scrambled to greet him barely looked his way. It stung, but he couldn't blame them. As Mark exited the building, a part of him still burned with resentment. Ethan Hayes had come in like a storm, sweeping everything and everyone aside, including him. But deep down, Mark knew there was more to it. He had been resistant to change, too focused on preserving his power rather than leading the company into the future. His leadership had stagnated, and now he was paying the price. It would have been easy to walk away, to retreat into the background and nurse his wounded pride. But something inside Mark wouldn't let him. He wasn't ready to fade into obscurity. Not yet. Months passed, and Mark found himself in an unexpected place, an executive leadership workshop. After weeks of introspection, he realized that his dismissal wasn't just a result of bad luck or external factors. It was the culmination of years of complacency and arrogance. The more he reflected, the more he understood that he had lost touch with what it meant to be a true leader. At the workshop, Mark was surrounded by other former executives, each with their own stories of downfall. He found a strange sense of camaraderie in the group. People who, like him, had been pushed out of positions of power after years of assuming they were untouchable. One exercise stood out. The facilitator, a no-nonsense woman with years of experience in leadership coaching, asked each participant to write down their biggest mistake as a leader. Mark hesitated, but finally wrote, "I stopped listening." The words stared back at him, simple yet profound. He had stopped listening to his team, to new ideas, and even to his own instincts. Instead, he had clung to old ways, believing that what worked in the past would always work in the future. Ethan had shattered that illusion. In that moment, Mark realized something important. Leadership wasn't about being in control. It was about fostering an environment where everyone could contribute and grow. And he had failed to do that. Months after his dismissal, Mark found himself sitting across from Ethan in a small coffee shop near the office he once commanded. Ethan had been surprised when Mark reached out, but he agreed to meet. The conversation was awkward at first, but Mark had come with a purpose. "I wanted to apologize," Mark began, shifting uncomfortably. "I fought you at every turn, and it wasn't because I thought you were wrong. It was because I didn't want to let go. Ethan looked at him, his expression thoughtful. It wasn't an easy situation for either of us, Mark. I get that. Mark nodded, grateful that Ethan wasn't holding a grudge. I spent so much time trying to hold on to my power that I forgot what it meant to lead. You came in with new ideas, and instead of listening, I shut you out. That was my mistake. Ethan took a sip of his coffee, then leaned forward. It takes a lot to admit that. I respect it. The two men sat in silence for a moment, the weight of the past lingering between them. But then Mark spoke again. I don't expect a second chance at Hayward, Mark said honestly. But I'd like to stay connected, maybe contribute in some way. I've learned a lot these past few months. I think I could still be of help. Ethan considered the offer carefully before nodding. We're always looking for people who want to be part of the solution. If you're serious about this, there might be opportunities to work together. For the first time in a long while, Mark felt something he hadn't expected. Hope. He wasn't returning to his old role, and he wasn't regaining the power he once had, but he was getting something far more important, a chance at redemption. Melissa Grayson was a woman who lived by numbers. As the CFO of Hayward Industries, she was known for her sharp, no-nonsense approach to financial management. Under her watch, the company had always met its targets, until it didn't. Melissa had spent months fighting against the innovative changes Ethan Hayes was proposing, seeing them as risky and financially unstable. But now, as she sat at her desk, reviewing the latest financial projections, something strange was happening. The numbers were improving, markedly. Ethan's focus on long-term investments in innovation and diversity, which she had initially opposed, was starting to yield results. The data was undeniable. She leaned back in her chair, staring at the spreadsheet in front of her. How had she been so wrong? Melissa had always prided herself on being able to predict trends, to make decisions based purely on logic and data. But something about Ethan's leadership had challenged that. It wasn't just about the financials anymore. It was about people, about creating an environment where creativity and innovation could thrive. And Melissa had realized that her rigid approach to leadership was hindering that growth. One afternoon, during a meeting with Ethan and the rest of the executive team, Melissa found herself speaking up in a way she hadn't before. "Ethan," she said, surprising herself with the vulnerability in her voice, "I'll admit, I've been resistant to a lot of the changes you've brought in, but I'm starting to see the value in them. I've been so focused on protecting the bottom line that I forgot the bigger picture." Ethan looked at her, a mix of surprise and understanding in his eyes. "It's not easy to shift perspective, Melissa. I appreciate that you're open to it." "I don't just want to protect the company," Melissa continued. "I want to help it grow, and I think I need to grow too." It was a turning point for Melissa, one that would redefine her role at Hayward Industries. Over the next few months, Melissa began to change her approach. She started attending the diversity and inclusion workshops Ethan had initiated, something she had initially dismissed as unnecessary. As she listened to stories from employees across different departments, she realized just how much the old leadership had failed to connect with the people who made the company run. One story stuck with her, a woman from the HR department who spoke about how she had been passed over for promotions because she didn't fit the traditional mold of leadership. Melissa saw herself in that story, but from the opposite perspective. She had been part of the problem, holding on to outdated ideas of what made a good leader. Determined to change, Melissa began advocating for policies that supported mentorship, inclusion, and innovation. She opened herself up to feedback from her team, allowing for more collaboration in decision-making, and slowly but surely she saw the culture shift. For the first time in years, Melissa felt like she wasn't just managing finances, she was helping build something meaningful. Jamila "Jam" Reynolds had always been a hard worker. As a junior administrative assistant at Hayward Industries, she had spent years doing her job quietly, never expecting much recognition. But when Ethan Hayes took over as CEO, something inside her began to change. Ethan's focus on inclusion and innovation gave her a sense of hope she hadn't felt before. For the first time, it seemed like someone at the top cared about people like her, people who didn't hold flashy titles but were still integral to the company's success. It all started during one of the company's new brainstorming sessions, which Ethan had opened up to employees at all levels. Jam had hesitated at first, unsure if her ideas would be taken seriously, but something about the new energy in the company pushed her forward. One afternoon, as the team discussed ways to improve internal communications, Jam found herself speaking up. "Why don't we create a digital suggestion box?" she said, her voice wavering slightly. "Something where employees can anonymously submit ideas or feedback. It would make people feel heard without fear of judgment." The room fell silent, and for a moment Jam regretted speaking up. But then Ethan nodded thoughtfully. "That's a great idea, Jam. Let's look into implementing that." Jam blinked, stunned. He had taken her suggestion seriously. As months passed, Jam became more confident in sharing her ideas. The digital suggestion box was a success, fostering open communication between employees and management. More importantly, it showed Jam that her voice mattered. She began taking on more responsibilities, volunteering to help with company-wide projects and participating in diversity workshops. Jam had always been someone who worked behind the scenes, but now she was invited to the table. One day, Claire Edwards, the operations director, pulled her aside after a meeting. "Jam, you've really impressed us over the past few months. We've been looking for someone to lead our new employee engagement initiative, and I think you'd be perfect for it." Jam was speechless. "Me? But I'm just an assistant." Claire smiled. "You were an assistant. Now you're a leader." By the end of the year, Jam had been promoted to head the Employee Engagement Initiative, a role that put her in charge of fostering communication and collaboration across departments. Her initiative helped create a more inclusive environment where everyone felt valued and heard. Looking back, Jam realized that it wasn't just about the promotion. It was about finding her voice, about realizing that she had something to contribute, even when she had doubted herself. And in the process, she helped create a company culture that allowed others to find their voices too. If these stories of transformation, leadership, and personal growth resonated with you, don't forget to hit the subscribe button for more content that inspires and challenges the way we think about leadership, innovation, and workplace culture. Your voice matters here. Just like Jam found hers, so can you. Subscribe now and be part of a community that values empathy, inclusion, and creativity.